Welcome, everyone. Galanch Dawado. My name is Galanch. My English name is Vance Black Fox, and many of you who have joined this evening, I have had the pleasure of seeing your name before on some of our presentations and lectures so far, and happy to see that you're back with us this evening. I just want to give us a couple more minutes to allow some other folks to join us. Hopefully we'll have some more folks enter in the next minute or so, and then we will get started. So if you could remember to please have your microphones off, which I think is the case for all of you, so that we don't have any background noise, but I think all of you have your mics off. And we'll start here in just a moment. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, OCO, Listi, welcome. Hello, everybody. Certainly glad that you're here. Thank you for joining us again for tonight's presentation as a part of the Truth and Healing Movement of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. This night, we are honored to have a dear friend of mine join us. But before I introduce her, I'd like for us to remember to take a moment to acknowledge where we are. This evening, I am located on the lands of the Southern Ute Indian tribe on their reservation here in what is now currently known as Durango, or Ignacio, excuse me, Colorado. I'm actually here at their resort, the Sky Ute Casino Resort, and going to be traveling to Rock Point in the next couple of days to visit one of our ministries and do some leadership stuff with some young people in between then. So I'm happy to be here. If you know, which I hope that you do, whose lands you on, whose indigenous lands you are on, why don't you take a moment to, I know you won't be able to see it, but I'd love to see, I can see it. If you would open the chat and put into the chat where you're coming from, whose land are you visiting from this evening? Unfortunately, you folks won't be able to see it, but I will be able to see it. Arapaho, Ute, Mdewakanton, Dakota. Thank you so much. Important for us to always remember that we're responsible for acknowledging the land and the peoples. The Kumeyaay people are being represented, or people, someone from the Cherokee on Kumeyaay land is with us tonight, the Menominee. It's important for us to acknowledge whose land we're on when we're gathered together. That is our commitment as a church, and so we will continue to do that. Thank you so much. And so this evening, we only have about an hour's time of presentation, and certainly grateful for my friend, Dr. Rosalee Gonzalez, who has agreed to join us this evening to talk a bit about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We as a church haven't spent much time focused on the declaration from the United Nations. And so I thought, well, this would be a great opportunity for us to begin our work and discover what has been happening at the United Nations in regard to Indigenous peoples, but also opportunity for us to figure out what is it that we might be missing in our work that might align more closely to what the UN has been about over the last few years. And so Dr. Rosalee Gonzalez is an Indigenous Peoples' Rights Scholar and leader, co-coordinator of the North American region of the Continental Network of Indigenous Women of the Americas. Rosalee has been working for quite some time with the United Nations and other international organizations to ensure that rights for Indigenous peoples are being realized and promoted amongst a variety of sectors. And so we're really grateful for Dr. Rosalee's time. So Doctor, if you'll join me on the screen. There she.
Good evening. Thank you, Vance, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Vance.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for being with us. I was saying before we got started here that when I'm around Dr. Gonzalez, I also find myself sometimes having to salsa and merengue and all those things, and so really grateful for the opportunity to celebrate the incredible world of dance with Dr. Gonzalez at times. And so always a joyful spirit and gathering people in community. And she's the witness that she has in that regard is just amazing. So thank you, Doctor. And so this evening, we're gonna have some conversation. And I know that at some point, Dr. Gonzalez will have a slide presentation, but maybe if I could, if you want to tell us where you're coming from, Doctor, and just a little more about yourself, if you'd like.
Yes. So I'm Rosalee Gonzalez, and I am Chicana Kickapoo. I have a foot in both worlds. My mother comes from northern Durango, Mexico, from the Tepehuanes indigenous peoples. She migrated as a child. She's what you would call today a migrant indigenous unaccompanied minor. And she migrated around the age of 13 and married my father at a young age, also a teenager, whose Kickapoo was urban indigenous from South Texas. And 5 kids later, among 11 kids, I was born. And so I was born in Oregon and raised in LA. So I always say I'm as urban as it gets. And that's a fact. And I've been around indigenous communities, indigenous women leaders in particular, who don't find it funny that I'm so proud to be so urban. And in the old days, and in some communities still today, that's actually, not a good thing. But in my case, it allows me to explain the migration journey of both my parents and how they met and how they evolved to create family in an urban setting like LA with no recognition of either their histories, and really for the children who were raised within the compound of our home to know what we know today. And so that's the experience of most American Indians across the country. We're 70% urban, and that's who I am as a Chicana Kickapoo. And I'm also a scholar. I have a PhD in the world of law and society. I have a dissertation and research work that's focused around the global Indigenous women's movement. I look at I basically look at how Indigenous women have risen into the international arena, taken it over, but really more so I've been concerned with how we take local claims, Indigenous claims for justice, what rights we feel are being violated locally, and how they have to shift. And they always have to shift. We have a history of shifting language to be heard in these international arenas. And so I'm fascinated by how that has evolved through the years. And really, I'm also fascinated with how we've negotiated and organized ourselves to be able to enter these international spaces, to be able to influence and come up with such international documents like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so that could not have been possible without us going in organized on the different highly contentious issues that states are so scared about discussing in these forums. And so that's pretty much what I do as a academic. I've worked for Arizona State University. I taught for over 12 years, and I left it not too long ago. I left it to go run a national human rights organization. I was executive director for the U.S. Human Rights Network, and one of the things that we do as that network, or did as that network, was to mobilize local communities, movements across the United States who aim to hold the United States accountable for human rights violations here at home, not in Mexico, not in Middle East, not in other parts of the world, but really to hold the US accountable for all the damage that it does on a daily basis to many people here in this country, whether it be Indigenous, African American, migrants, women, LGBTQ, all of them, right? All of us. And so that was very lovely work that has shaped much of my work. I'm also proud to say that I'm an insider outsider to the UN, meaning I've worked for 2 of 4 of its Indigenous mechanisms. I worked for the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous people, and later worked for the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And so with that, I gained a lot of insider knowledge. I grew an amazing network within the UN, many allies that I feel have now helped not only shape the advocacy work that I do, but to influence it and really, be able to assist not only the organizations or communities that I represent, but others. And I'm happy to share more on that if it comes up on Q&A, but that's the background that I bring to you. And I'm really honored to just guide you through a conversation about the UN Declaration. I did prepare a PowerPoint with the intention of, guiding me through, an important document that's mapped out a number of issues that are of concern to us here at home. And really, it's a global document. And so, as I go through it, think globally, but then think, nationally, what's happening here in the US. And so with that, I turn it back over to Vance.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, so before I turn it back over to you, I want to say for folks, for those of you who have questions, would you please, at any point in time, choose the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Use the Q&A. We probably won't be paying attention to the questions in the chat. So if you do have a question, put it in the Q&A. Which you can find at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be monitoring those, and we'll have some time toward the end of the presentation tonight. So certainly I have questions, but some of the questions Dr. Gonzalez already knows, and so I will, if I don't know if you want to go into your presentation now, and I can ask those questions, or if later along with the others, and but I think you have a ability to share.
Maybe it'd be good to start with introducing the deck, or maybe I was told that I should start at the beginning, the very basic, provide you a very basic overview of the declaration, and that's what I prepared for. But if you have, deeper questions about the declaration and its implementation, by all means, please let me know. But with that, let me see if I can get back to sharing my screen. So I'll be speaking to you about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I just wanted to review a couple of things on who are Indigenous peoples, so we're not making assumptions on who we are. But first, I want to start by saying that, Indigenous peoples are recognized as being among the world's most vulnerable, disadvantaged, and marginalized peoples. That's just a fact. It doesn't come from a strengths perspective there. It's just a fact. And this is meant to include in all forms, socially, culturally, especially economically, and of course, legally. We are disadvantaged and marginalized. And it's spread across, we're spread across the world from the Arctic to the South Pacific. And we number, and this isn't written in the they, but it's a we. They number at a rough estimate more than 370 million in some 90 countries. So this is important because you can't pass any Indigenous peoples resolutions or like this, a declaration, without considering where are Indigenous peoples located, not only within the US, but this is worldwide. The UN is looking at the globe. And so out of 193 members that make up the UN, 90 of them have large Indigenous populations or significant, where it matters to include laws and policies that affect us. And so while we constitute approximately 5% of the world's population, Indigenous peoples make up 15% of the world's poor and the world's extremely poor. And so this just gives you a picture of where we're at socially, economically, global in a global picture. Also, now these are our strengths. We have very unique and distinctive languages, cultures, languages, legal systems, and histories. And it's important to note that we have legal systems like tribal courts, or in many places they're called ancestral courts, where Indigenous peoples, or they're called Indigenous institutions. These systems have been in place since time immemorial, and Indigenous peoples have been creating law, policy, and regulating their communities and their Indigenous nations since forever. They've evolved, they look differently, and the state often doesn't recognize them, or in the case of the US, does recognize them. And we've gone through some historical shifts to accommodate, to be able to coexist within a country like the US, Canada, etc. So most Indigenous peoples have a strong connection to the environment and their traditional lands and territories. This matters in all issues related to Indigenous people, specifically when we were negotiating and determining the declaration. They also often share legacies of removal from traditional lands and territories, subjugation, destruction of their cultures, discrimination, and widespread violation of their human rights. Now, this is important, this idea of removal, because it's not only 500 years ago, this is happening today. We see mega projects that are occurring that are being designed without free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous nations. And so they're coming in and they're being confronted. These businesses are being confronted by Indigenous peoples. And so this issue about being removed or still trying to be displaced is a very current issue on a global scale. And again, we can talk about examples. Now, we're in a very historic year, and so I'm very happy to speak to you today, this month, because I just returned from Geneva, Switzerland last week. I was there commemorating the 100th years since the first attempt of an Indigenous chief to enter the United Nations. And so Chief Descahe was Haudenosaunee, the Cayuga Nation. And 100 years ago, he showed up arguing to what was then the League of Nations, which is the name of the UN at one time, the earliest time. And he showed up making the argument that he needed to move over because he needed a seat at the table. And he was there representing the oldest United Nation, which is the Iroquois Confederacy, made up of 6 Indigenous nations in the northeastern part of the US. And they had already, since time immemorial, had this relationship. They had already established agreements on everything like any other nation state across the world. And so they exemplified that what he argued was the earliest UN, and Indigenous peoples should be at the table. And of course, he was rejected and turned away. However, something beautiful occurred. The mayor of Geneva, Switzerland welcomed him and hosted a diplomatic reception where he was given the platform to discuss his issues. And the issues were around colonization, sovereignty, self-determination, and how all the treaties among those within the Confederacy were being violated by the United States. And so he had a grievance, and everyone heard. And so who showed up were all of the ambassadors. Many of the ambassadors that sit at the League of Nations, they make it to the venue, and it becomes the first time an Indigenous chief addresses the UN in an informal meeting hosted by the mayor of G. So we just came back from a lovely celebration where we talk about the significance. Now, one of the things that I later learned about Chief Descaji before he dies, so he shows up in 1923, and before he passes on, he addressed the next generation of Indigenous leaders. And one of the things that he told them was that they needed to fight for their rights, the same way the white man fights for his rights, and that we were equal citizens, and we were humans, and we were all these things equal in human manhood, is the language that he used at the time. But the argument was that they needed to think about how laws, international laws, mattered locally. And so that was the general message that he intended for that next generation, who then took about 50 years later for an official first entry to the United Nations. It's actually in 1977. There's a modern Indigenous rights movement which gained momentum in the 60s and 70s. And if you remember, the American Indian movement, among other movements like the Black Panthers, the Brown Power movement, all of these movements are on the rise in the 60s leading up to the 70s, even the peace movement, anti-war movement. And within that momentum, we see a large number of Indigenous NGOs that at the time, I believe there were only like 7. By 2000, I remember the number was 13. But Indigenous peoples have always been trying to, get their foot in the door, be organized to get that foot in the door. And so it was through that leadership that they make their first official entry. And we see from 1977 to 1982, within a 5-year period, we see the birth of the first UN mechanism called, it's every body, like these different bodies are called mechanisms. And so we see the first Indigenous mechanism called the Working Group on Indigenous Populations. Now, this is very important to note that once upon a time, the UN called us populations, and the states refused to recognize us as peoples. They would call us communities, and still some nation states, like some countries in Africa, continue to have debates on whether or not they have Indigenous peoples. And so for political reasons, this term peoples has been denied. And today, for example, we'll hear states reference Indigenous peoples as first inhabitants in local communities, Indigenous communities, and here you'll see the operative word is Indigenous populations, and basically, this gets highly contentious, highly politicized, and we have a major victory with the adoption of the declaration when we gain the word peoples, and I'll go through that in a little bit. But this mandate was exclusive. It required exclusive attention to issues related to Indigenous peoples. And so what this became was the first body to talk about all the critical issues affecting Indigenous peoples on a global scale. Didn't just focus on Indigenous peoples of the US. We had to focus on big picture stuff and basically agree on those issues and then discuss them. And this became the space where the Declaration was drafted and negotiated. And so what is the Declaration? So the Declaration is the result of almost 25 years of collaboration between UN member states and Indigenous peoples from around the world. Indigenous leaders from Canada, US, actually everybody, played a significant role in its development, including the drafting and negotiation. So, you know, every document has those phases: argue, you agree, you draft, and then we negotiate, and then we go back to drafting. It's the only declaration that has taken almost 3 decades to adopt within the UN. And so this is how significant every article is within this declaration. And just to make a comparison, I've worked with Vance at the UN. I love seeing Vance and Jen show up to support not only Indigenous peoples, but I've seen Jen supporting the work of people of African descent. And so, you know, I've assisted both bodies in different capacities, but, you know, it took us almost 3 decades to pass the Declaration. And right now it's an absolute, I want to say a miracle, but it's also very telling of of the difference in the weight of the types of issues that are being presented for both declarations. So now the people of African descent will have a declaration. It's now being, you know, considered, drafted, and actually we had consultations with Indigenous peoples leaders to advise and help this leadership of people of African descent in considering many of the issues that we learned from. And so one of the key issues was, well, you're going to have it easier because you're not talking about land. But the Declaration specifically, you know, you can't talk about Indigenous peoples' issues and not discuss lands, territories, and resources. And the preservation of identities, the preservation of culture, and all the distinctive factors of Indigenous peoples. And so, you know, those things were the deeper issues that really took that many years. And so we finally get a declaration passed in 2007. And what does it include? It has 24 preambular provisions, 46 articles that set out the minimum standards for, and one of the ways that we explain this is, these are the minimum standards for how Indigenous peoples can and should be treated by any state, you know, any country, any federal government. And so these are the minimum standards for the survival, the dignity, the well-being of Indigenous peoples throughout the world, including the rights related to governance, which is our sovereignty, health, community, culture, language, lands, territories, resources, and education. And so this is sort of the list of our list of issues that were agreed to from 1977 to 2007. These were the core issues affecting all of us worldwide. And so that's what the Declaration embodies. Now, the politics of adopting the Declaration are that out of 193 countries, there were 4 countries that did not sign, including the US. The US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia outright refused to support the Declaration. And so it took us a bit. The Declaration is a declaration. So one thing to note is that this Declaration is annexed to a resolution of the General Assembly. So it's not a treaty. It's not a covenant. It's not a protocol, and cannot be signed or ratified by the UN, by its members, by that body, whether by that body. So I'll pause. So for example, we have 10 conventions, international, one on CEDAW, women's rights, child rights, labor rights. Those are all treaties. The US has signed on to some of them. And so a treaty it operates differently. I'll stop there. It has legal teeth. It's a legal obligation. The country gets reviewed. There's an entire process. If you sign on the dotted line to a treaty, you have obligations to fulfill. So this is not a treaty, it's a declaration. So what's in the declaration and why did we argue so much for 25 years? So there are some general principles within the declaration. This is a general breakdown. The 5 principles are on equality and non-discrimination. What does that mean? Indigenous people should not be discriminated in law, in policy, in practice. We're equal. This is raising the standard. Again, think of the time in history where Indigenous peoples were not considered human and we had no human rights. And so, this is, a principle of great value. And here's the key word, individual and collective rights. So we have civil rights in the US, everyone, right? We all have civil rights. We all have, the Bill of Rights. These are all individual rights. I cannot be discriminated as a US citizen versus my neighbor. We are equal. We have these protections under law. But what makes us distinct is I'm Indigenous and I belong to a nation and I belong to a community and I have collective rights. And so these things get teased out in 25 years and they're articulated within the declaration, this distinction. So as an Indigenous woman leader, when I take the floor at the UN, I always say, here we stand before you, something like that, and we will defend all our bundle of rights, both collective and individual rights. And so we want it to go on the record. We're not just here as, US citizens, we're here as Indigenous citizens with both bundles of rights, okay? Next, this issue of self-determination, self-governance, and recognition of treaties. There's 3 articles, again. A couple years ago, there was a treaty, if you're interested in more of this, but we know that the US has had a long history of not meeting its treaty obligations with a number of tribes. And so this is a very important issue that leads into the issue of implementation and redress. So under the declaration, you have 6 articles on taking appropriate measures, conflict resolution, financial and technical assistance. And so this basically means Canada is far more advanced than the United States at this time in taking appropriate measures to ensure the implementation of the declaration. So this means that they've already examined their constitution and redrafted, re-examined, and looked at all the gaps between the declaration and their constitution and are working towards, remedying that. So that's a huge step towards taking appropriate measurements. So the US is very far from that. But there are certain departments, including the Department of Interior, who are referencing the declaration, that are making note of the declaration to strengthen what it is they're doing. Conflict resolution, there's something called FPIC, which you may or may not know. It's called free, prior, and informed consent. We believe this is the answer to avoiding conflict. Please come ask Indigenous peoples what we think about your mega project. And it doesn't just mean, consulting. It means free, meaning without coercion. You will come, seek out, we'll provide full information. This is the project, this is the intention, this is how it's going to damage, this is how we're going to mitigate, all of it, the full information. And then the community has a right to consent, agree, but we also have a right to say no, disagree, and you must go. And you must go peacefully. There's no need to come back and start bullying and killing the people. It means free, prior, and firm consent. If we agree that it's no, the offer is off. Thank you for visiting. So this is a huge piece in avoiding conflict and remedying conflict. Please consult. So, and then the other one is technical assistance, which is along the same lines of providing just consultation, not only in those moments of conflicts, but also in developing all policy that has to do with Indigenous peoples. Don't design it in DC. Come to the communities, come to the, institutions, Indigenous institutions to partner, consult, and design the policies and laws that will not hurt us, but empower communities. There are 7 articles on lands, territories, and resources. And so, I won't go into the differences, but lands and territories are 2 different things, open land and territories are marketed lands to an indigenous population, I just said the P word, the indigenous nation. So the 7 articles have to deal with ownership, protection from relocation, military use, adjudication of rights, redress for non-concessional taking of lands, and then you'll see FPIC is listed under that. This is huge, huge. There was just a study on the militarization. It was called The Impacts of Militarization and the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It was drafted this last year, was presented in Geneva last 2 weeks ago, and it was open for discussion. And Indigenous peoples from the US today are still confronting violations of these articles of the Declaration. So we have the case of Oak Flats here in Arizona, where I'm located, and they're fighting legislation. They just lost, like a couple months ago, they just lost major legislation that will allow a mega corporation to come in and mine. And, they haven't resolved the effects and impact of uranium when they mined and have extracted and left toxins out and canyons wide open for, illness and disease. Yet in a neighboring community today, 2023, that's the intention, to go in and mine for many natural resources without consent or consideration of the tribe. So we saw a number of American Indian communities show up defending themselves, drawing on these articles. And so another part of the declaration is on environment. There's one article on conservation and environmental protection of Indigenous lands, which is, pretty straightforward. But this has been utilized around issues of water. Why don't we have access to clean water? Navajo Nation just lost another big Supreme Court decision with access to the Colorado River, and it was denied. Yet they're being forced to continue to take water from these smaller lakes, smaller rivers that have been contaminated. They've been contaminated for decades, and so many of them are losing access even to that toxic water. And so these are just some of those issues. And then you have 7 articles on civil and political rights that deal with identity, community membership, security of the person, protection against forced assimilation and relocation, and labor rights. And so these 7 articles talk to who is Indigenous And one of the things that the declaration or the working group discussed for many years was, and they ensured that internationally we will not use the US blood quantum definition of who is Indigenous. This is as colonial as it gets. And so to deter us from that, an Indigenous way of identifying who's Indigenous is allowing the Indigenous community. We identify each other. We identify the types of marriages that exist in our community, the type of, the lineage, practices the religion matters, or the spiritualities, the cultural traditions of the people. And so basically it's in the hands of the people to identify who is and is not Indigenous. And then lastly, we have the history of boarding schools in the United States. And so this article, one of the articles on civil and political rights, has to do with pushing back on, ongoing efforts to force assimilate Indigenous peoples around the world. And so that's included, labor rights is included. Also, there are 4 articles on participation in Indigenous institutions. So this is huge because it'll lead to what can the church. It's really important for Indigenous peoples to participate in decision making. And we say, it was the disability movement that came up with the slogan that says, nothing about us without us, right? And so we flipped it and said, everything about us with us. That means we must be at the table. We can't no longer create, federal policy or state policy about Indigenous peoples without us being at the table. So participation in decision-making really matters, and engagement really matters. And then recognizing our institutional structures absolutely matters. You can't just come through any Indigenous nations and not recognize that we have a tribal council. You have to go through the Indigenous leaders, whether we like them or not. They've been elected and they have a role. And so the federal government should recognize these institutions, but also the tribal governments. And this is really big with, this issue of missing, murdered, and Indigenous women and peoples in general, because there's a little matter called jurisdiction and who can and can't be tried when they commit crimes on Indigenous reservations. And so these are the types of institutions that should always be honored and recognized. There are articles that favor that. And then economic and social rights. There's 5 that look at economic and land development. And I could go off explaining what examples we have on that too, but I want to keep going so we can open it to Q&A. Improving social economic conditions and the rights to traditional medicines and health. For whether we're talking about Indigenous midwifery, I was part of a study. We only have 30 Indigenous midwives, recognized Indigenous midwives across the United States, 30. And how many babies are being born? They're not being born under the care of traditional healers. And so this is important to many of us. So these are the articles that deal with that. Cultural, religious, and linguistic rights. There's 6 articles on cultural heritage, histories, languages, spiritual traditions, and relationship with land. There was recently a study also that came out of the Inter-American, was it the Inter-American? No, I believe it was the OAS. These are bodies across, the UN is global, and then there's America's based human rights bodies. And there was a study on the persecution of Indigenous spiritual leaders who have been labeled witches. And so these are still issues happening today. This is not hundreds of years ago. This is like last year, there was a call for input. Anyone that knows of any cases or individuals that have been persecuted, either socially or by law criminalized or murdered, speak up. And so these are the rights that address some of those. Education, information, and media. There's 3 articles on the control over educational systems, access to not only education, but again, quality education, culturally relevant education, and that it be public education and media in our own languages. So again, the type of information, and for a long time, you know, our Indigenous communities have been indoctrinated, and so we have no control over the production of knowledge that our children receive. And so this is, you know, these articles are looking at having control over that information. And so I'll just note that although the declaration was not signed by the US in 2007, 3 years later, it was President Barack Obama who did sign and stated the US is in full support of the declaration. Now, again, the UN DRIP is not legally binding on states, and it does not impose legal obligations on governments. But like all human rights instruments, so these are the conventions, the treaties, they're all called instruments, they carry moral force. They carry moral force. The US does not want, for example, under the Trump administration, the US is a signatory to the, which convention does it fall under? We have a special rapporteur on extreme poverty. And so the rapporteur does a country visit, comes to the US and visited Indigenous communities, went out to, they were Lakotas, White Mountain Apaches, the Homas from Louisiana, everybody showed up to give testimony of extreme poverty, including immigrants, including Black Southern communities. And so when we get to the UN, this is the year that President Trump withdraws from the Human Rights Council, but follows with a statement that says, it's all a lie. It's all a lie. Fake news. He called us fake news. There's no extreme poverty in the United States. And then the response was, we'll come visit South Dakota. We'll be happy to walk you around Pine Ridge, where we have communities without water, toilets, etc., with no modernity, access to modernity. And so this issue of moral force is very powerful internationally. And so he rebutted and it went back and forth. So while not endorsing the UN DRIP, the US has agreed to support the declaration. The declaration is the highest achievement of 45 years of Indigenous people's advocacy at the UN. But it's not the only thing. We now have 4 mechanisms, bodies. One is the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. It was established in 2001. 2001? It's 2002. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that was established right before it in 2001. We have the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's the 3rd group out of Geneva. And I emphasize EMRIP because it's an advisory body to the Human Rights Council, and it's highly contentious terrain. What gets discussed at EMRIP, that's the acronym EMRIP, is highly considered and scrutinized at the same time, because the final report that comes from this body is submitted to the Human Rights Council for adoption. And all I can say is they are recommending to conduct future studies on difficult issues. They're there to advise the UN on difficult issues. This last year, it had to do with militarization and the impacts on Indigenous peoples. And let me tell you, Russia was not happy. Neither was China, neither was Indonesia, neither was the US was calm. But some of these states will go out of their way and really bully Indigenous leaders on the ground at the session. And we've known that of higher cases of reprisals when they go home. And so this is a violation of GRIP. Why? Because we are invited to fully participate and engage. We are there as diplomatic warriors. And we're not there with our army. We're there to be diplomatic and engage in creation of policy and laws that, and to clarify the seriousness of some issues so that this body can advise states, right? And so it gets highly contentious. And I really love MRIP. The difference between MRIP and the Permanent Forum is that the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues sits under Economic and Social Council. Please don't quote me for this, but I call it the welfare office. It's not very scholarly for me to say this, but it's where you go to be heard to develop programs and services, economic and social services. So all of the agencies show up with an interest of hearing what are the latest issues, what are the latest trends, assessing, they go back, UN Women goes back, and now UN Women is looking at what are their strategies, how can they have something to do to affect and impact the lives of Indigenous women, but they're not standard setting. Human Rights Council, they're setting standards. This is where laws are being discussed. And so depending on where the church wants to have a greater impact, it matters where, we go. And so I think both are truly very important spaces. And then lastly, there's a UN Voluntary Fund on for Indigenous peoples. This is a body that fundraises all year long, again, to ensure that Indigenous peoples get funded to attend these mechanisms, these sessions. And there's never enough money. There's never enough resources. This was the largest delegation of fellows this year. They had 50 Indigenous leaders that come from all over. But still, what are 50 in the big picture of true representation of who gets to the table? So I want to end with highlighting two things, because I was asked to consider what can y'all do. The first thing I think is I really think self-supporting Indigenous representation in international meetings where issues about us are being discussed and decided matters. I think it's important to support your Indigenous leadership, Vance, to continue to be in those spaces. It's consistency matters. All it takes is 1 year for you not to show up, and then you feel you've lost not only rapport, you've lost really an assessment. And the more you go, I've been to 23 sessions of the Permanent Forum in different capacities. Everybody knows Rosalee, and I know most of the folks. I know people being elected, I know people being decided, I know the states, I know. And so then in that space, I can leverage that broad network that I've created in 23 years. So it takes consistency and presence, not only from your church leaders, but I think your community leaders, who your constituents are. They need to know that there's a place where they can come and uplift their issues. And then lastly, training and education. This is huge. Indigenous peoples do not know this is happening. They don't have a clue that 100 years ago, a chief went to the UN. They have no clue that I just went to MRIP last 2 weeks ago, and they're discussing oak flax. They're discussing Pine Ridge. They're discussing all these different, community, Mauna Kea. These are all communities that have shown up, and really bringing the information home is still vastly needed. But training and education of Indigenous people's rights locally, really, I think we can't do enough. We're behind in the game. And so if I could just leave you with those two recommendations, supporting representation and training and education, I hope I did my job today. And please, any questions?
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, so there's appreciate that, Rosalee. Just so for those of you, you cut out just a moment when she said, what can the church do? That's what she's suggesting, those two things. And so just want to make sure I'm repeating that and reiterating the importance, and I agree 100%. So thank you for that. There are no questions as of yet in our Q&A, but are there any questions from anybody who's joined us this evening? So again, one of the things that we wanted to have happen was to make sure that in this truth and healing movement that we were looking at the ways in which Indigenous peoples are doing work and have been doing work on behalf of themselves, for behalf of themselves and other Indigenous peoples around the world, is this process, this UN process to develop UN DRIP and the mechanisms that were put in place. There's so many folks around the world who don't know that that ever happened, that it's happening, and that progress continues to strengthen and to grow. And so wanted to make sure that we had someone who was an expert and has been to and engaging the UN in a variety of capacities over time to share this with us. And so certainly glad that we had that opportunity this evening. One of the things that, okay, we have a question here. Can you please repeat the two things that the church can do there again for us?
Yeah, so the first was support ensuring the self-representation, that Indigenous leadership attend and participate wherever Indigenous people's issues are being discussed. And so whether it's these mechanisms or there's also, other UN bodies that are meeting. This October, the US is being reviewed. And I don't, I am not participating, so I don't know what communities, and this is for all US civil society, not just Indigenous, who is going to show up from the Indigenous communities to address concerns. But it's at the Human Rights Council, and so that was one. Ensure the participation. That means investing, right? That means raising funds and having a selection process to support your congregation, your leaders. I don't know what the organizational structure is, but it would mean having the resources to support them to be there to speak for themselves. Two, training and education, disseminating this kind of information down to local leaders, local communities. They know a declaration exists, that they know this UN mechanism is in play. And I think those are two things.
Yeah, great, thank you. Any other questions? I do want to say that Rosalee referenced Jen, who was present at both the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, but also the African Descent Forum. And Jen De Leon, I believe, if she isn't here still, she was here a little earlier, but Jen De Leon is the Director of Racial Justice for, oh, there she is. She's got a different name tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. But Jen, I know that you've been to both of these events, and I know that just the one that I've been to this past spring, that Dr. Gonzalez was a great help to us. So Jen represented with me and Isabel Retamosa, who's one of our young Native leaders, who Rosalee got to meet just briefly, I believe, while we were there in New York City. But anyway, all that to say, Dr. Gonzalez does an incredible job has done an incredible job, and so graciously so, to orient us to the process and to include us in discussions and to introduce us to the peoples and to let us know where we might want to be when things are happening. And so I just want to say thank you to you, Dr. Gonzalez, for being that person for us, an advocate and ally with us as we in the Lutheran Church, anyway, the ELCA, continue to figure out how we're most present and most effectively present with as people who, from the communities. So we're just really thankful for that.
Absolutely. I see another question, and it's coming for Calvin. Can I close by answering that question?
Yes, please.
So Calvin is asking, how do we go forward with truth and healing? How might we involve leaders from Indigenous nations in guiding us regarding what and how to do this? And what I suggest is taking a UN approach. They started a working group on Indigenous populations, perhaps an advisory committee, of experts, of folks who have strategic partnerships across Indian country, or maybe within the church. And then be open to their advice, be open to listening to what they think, that future should look like.
Sure. No, thank you for that. And just so both you and Calvin know, we do have a large team of folks that have been commissioned by the presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton, and it's called the Repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force. And so it serves as a similar body to that, but I think it can be strengthened in a variety of ways. And I think other folks can be pulled into these conversations to guide us in the other directions we might want to go. But in fact, that sub-task force of that task force created our own declaration. So I'll share that with you later, Dr. Gonzalez, but we have the declaration, the ELCA's declaration to American Indian Alaska Native people. And it lists for us the confessions, all the confessions that we needed to confess, all the things we've been about and complicit in, implicated in, and then commitments. So Calvin, I'll send that to you as well. But there's a movement has already started inside the church in regard to truth and healing, but I love that you asked the question, Calvin, and I'm thankful for how you answered it, because I think, again, a UN approach and rethinking about ways in which we are including, especially younger leaders, and growing them is certainly necessary to consider and to put into place. So thank you for that. Well, Dr. Gonzalez, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening, for joining us in the Truth and Healing movement in this way. I'm so grateful just to be able to spend a little time with you, even if it is getting lectured about the UN and learning more. Though I'm looking for other opportunities to be with her. I went to the roster of ministers gathering in Phoenix, and at the same time she was in Geneva. So I didn't get to see her, Jen didn't see her, hoping to introduce her to folks, but we'll find other times to engage folks. If you'll look in at the chat right now before we take off, Caitlin has placed in the chat the link to the declaration itself. And so please open that up real quick and save that to your favorites. Take some time to read it. I think that's an also important task for all of us as people who work in the church. Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. I appreciate you so much. Let's give her a round of applause for her work this evening and all the work that she's been about over the last many years in this field. So thank you. And thank you to all of you for joining us. We'll be having some more Indian 101 classes and Introduction to Truth and Healing classes coming up, as well as a variety of other presentations that are being scheduled presently. So be looking at the calendar on our webpage, and we'll be putting them there as soon as they're ready. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thank you.